Dad always loved throwing these big family reunions. Every summer, without fail, he'd send out invitations on expensive cardstock, calling everyone to gather at the old Victorian house on Maple Street that had been in our family for 3 generations. But this year felt different from the moment I pulled into the circular driveway. Grandpa had passed away just 2 months earlier, and the weight of that loss hung over everything like fog rolling in from Lake Michigan. I sat in my car for a few minutes watching relatives I barely spoke to anymore file through the front door. Aunt Margaret with her perfectly coiffed hair, Uncle Robert checking his phone every 30 seconds, my cousins who only showed up when they needed something. The house looked the same as always, white columns, wraparound porch, flower boxes that Mom obsessed over every spring. But something felt hollow about it now. Maybe it was knowing Grandpa wouldn't be sitting in his usual spot by the fireplace, telling the same stories about working at the steel mill in Gary. Or maybe it was the way everyone kept glancing at each other sideways, like they were all thinking the same thing, but nobody wanted to say it first. I finally forced myself out of the car and walked up the familiar stone path. The front door was already open, and I could hear the sound of forced conversation drifting out. That particular kind of chatter that happens when people who don't really like each other have to pretend they do. Mom rushed over the second I stepped inside, her face flushed and her hands fidgeting with her pearl necklace. She did that when she was nervous, had been doing it since I was little. "Oh, honey, you made it," she said, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Your father's been waiting for everyone to arrive." The living room was packed with people holding crystal glasses and making small talk that felt more like a performance than actual conversation. I spotted Dad immediately. He was standing near the mantelpiece, wearing his best navy suit and that expression he got when he was about to make some kind of announcement. Ethan was right beside him, naturally, looking comfortable in a way that always made my stomach twist. My younger brother had this gift for making any room feel like his personal kingdom. Even now, at 32, he had that same easy confidence he'd carried since high school, when he was quarterback and student body president, and everything else that made Dad beam with pride. He caught my eye and gave me a little wave, but something about it felt different today, almost apologetic. I found an empty chair near the window and accepted a glass of wine from one of the caterers Dad had hired. The Pinot Grigio was probably expensive, knowing him, but it tasted like anxiety in my mouth. I kept glancing around the room, trying to read the mood. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something, but nobody was talking about what that something might be. Grandma sat in the corner, quiet as always, watching everything with those sharp blue eyes that never missed a detail. At 94, she moved slowly, but her mind was still razor sharp. She'd been living with us since Grandpa died, and I'd noticed how she observed people, really observed them, like she was filing away information for later use. The conversation gradually died down as more people noticed Dad standing there waiting. He had that look on his face that I remembered from childhood, the one that meant he'd made up his mind about something and wasn't interested in hearing other opinions. Mom had stopped fidgeting with her necklace and was now gripping her wine glass so tightly I was worried it might shatter. "Well," Dad said finally, his voice carrying easily across the room, "I think we all know why we're really here today." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Nobody was pretending to make small talk anymore. This was it, the moment we'd all been dreading and expecting in equal measure. Dad didn't waste time with pleasantries or build-up. He just stood there, hands clasped behind his back, and delivered the news like he was reading from a grocery list. "I've decided to leave the entire estate to Ethan. The house, the investment accounts, the life insurance policies, everything. $5 million total." The words hit me like I'd walked into a glass door I didn't see coming. For a second, I wondered if I'd misheard him, if maybe he'd said something else entirely. But the silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, the same clock that had marked time in this house since before I was born. I looked around the room, hoping someone would laugh or tell me this was some kind of sick joke. Instead, I saw Aunt Margaret staring down at her hands, Uncle Robert suddenly very interested in his phone screen, my cousins shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Nobody was looking at me, which somehow made it worse than if they'd been staring. Ethan had the decency to look uncomfortable, but he didn't say anything. He just sat there in that leather chair that Dad had always claimed was too good for everyday use, and accepted his fortune like it was his due. Maybe in his mind it was. Maybe in Dad's mind too. I felt heat creeping up my neck. That familiar burn of humiliation that I'd carried around since childhood whenever Dad made it clear who his favorite was. But this wasn't about a birthday gift or who got to sit in the front seat of the car. This was my father telling an entire room full of people that I was worth nothing to him. That 45 years of being his daughter had earned me exactly $0 and zero consideration. Mom made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a whimper, but when I looked at her, she was staring at Dad with an expression I couldn't quite read. She didn't rush to defend me or demand an explanation. She just stood there, clutching that wine glass like it was keeping her upright. Now, I know some of you might have questions, Dad continued, as if he'd just announced the dinner menu instead of destroying whatever was left of our family dynamic. But I've thought this through carefully. Ethan has shown the most responsibility, the most commitment to the family business. He's the natural choice. The family business. That was rich. Ethan had worked at Dad's construction company for exactly 18 months after college before deciding he wanted to pursue other opportunities. Those other opportunities had included a failed restaurant, a brief stint as a day trader, and currently, some kind of consulting business that I'd never quite understood. Meanwhile, I'd been teaching high school English for 20 years, raising 2 kids mostly on my own after my divorce, and taking care of Mom when she had her hip surgery last year. But apparently, none of that qualified as responsibility or commitment. I wanted to stand up and scream at all of them. I wanted to ask Dad why he'd even bothered having me if he was just going to spend the rest of his life making it clear I was a disappointment. I wanted to ask Mom why she wasn't saying anything, why she was just standing there like a statue while her husband publicly humiliated their daughter. Instead, I sat there and took it. Because that's what I'd been doing my whole life, taking it. Accepting that Ethan was the golden child and I was just the practice kid, the rough draft before they figured out how to do parenting right. The room stayed quiet except for the sound of someone's stomach growling. Probably Uncle Robert, who could never skip a meal. Dad looked satisfied, like he'd just completed an important business transaction. Ethan was staring at his hands now, and I caught him glancing at me once with something that might have been guilt. I finished my wine in one long swallow and set the glass down harder than I meant to. The sound echoed in the silence, and for a moment everyone looked at me, waiting to see what I'd do. Part of me wanted to storm out, to slam the door behind me and never speak to any of them again. But I stayed put, because leaving would have felt like admitting they were right about me, that I really was worth nothing. That's when Grandma stood up. I'd almost forgotten she was there, sitting so quietly in her usual corner chair with the faded floral print. But suddenly she was on her feet, moving slowly but with purpose, her cane tapping against the hardwood floor with each step. The whole room seemed to hold its breath as she made her way across to where I was sitting. She'd been getting frailer since Grandpa died, but there was something different about her now. Her spine was straighter, her chin lifted in a way that reminded me of old photographs from when she was young, before she became someone's wife and mother and grandmother. She looked like herself again, if that makes any sense. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice softer than usual but carrying clearly across the silent room. She reached into the pocket of her navy cardigan, the same one she'd been wearing to family gatherings for as long as I could remember, and pulled out a white envelope. I thought it might be a card, maybe something she'd written to make me feel better about Dad's announcement. Grandma had always been the one to remember birthdays and anniversaries, to send little notes when someone was going through a hard time. I expected something sweet and grandmotherly, a few kind words to soften the blow. What I didn't expect was the check. At first, the numbers didn't make sense. I stared at the piece of paper in my hands, trying to process what I was seeing. $125 million. Made out to me, in Grandma's careful handwriting that still looked exactly the same as it had on all those birthday cards over the years. The room exploded. Ethan shot out of his chair so fast he knocked over his water glass. Dad's face went completely white, then red, then white again. Mom actually stumbled backward like she'd been physically pushed. Even Uncle Robert looked up from his phone. "Jesus Christ, Mother," Dad said, his voice cracking on the words. "What the hell is this?" Grandma didn't even look at him. She kept her eyes on me, and for the first time in years, I felt like someone was really seeing me. Not the disappointment daughter, or the divorced teacher, or the woman who never quite measured up. Just me. "This is money your grandfather and I set aside years ago," she said calmly, like she was discussing the weather. We invested well, lived below our means, and made some smart decisions with that land we bought outside Chicago back in the 70s. Turns out it was worth more than we thought. I was still staring at the check, trying to make my brain accept that this was real. $125 million. It was more money than I'd ever imagined having, more than I'd ever even dreamed about. It was enough to pay off my mortgage, put my kids through college, maybe even retire early if I wanted to. But why? I started to ask, then stopped because my voice was shaking too much to continue. Grandma smiled, and suddenly she looked 20 years younger. Because you're the only one in this room who reminds me of myself when I was your age. You work hard, you don't complain, and you take care of people without expecting anything in return. Your grandfather always said you had good character, and character matters more than anything else. Dad was sputtering now, trying to form words that weren't coming out right. Ethan looked like someone had hit him with a baseball bat. The rest of the family was just staring, probably doing math in their heads and realizing that I'd just become the richest person in the room by a factor of about 25. I looked down at the check again, and this time, the numbers seemed real. This wasn't just money, it was freedom. It was validation. It was proof that someone had been paying attention all these years. Someone had noticed that I mattered. "Grandma," I whispered, but she was already turning away, walking back to her chair with that same purposeful stride. The chaos that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced in that house, and I'd grown up with Ethan and his friends playing football in the living room. Mom lost it completely. I'd never seen her like this before, not even during the worst fights she and Dad had when I was growing up. She went from shocked silence to full-blown rage in about 3 seconds, and suddenly she was screaming at Grandma like a woman possessed. "How could you do this to me?" she shrieked, her voice so high and sharp it hurt my ears. "How could you betray me like this?" The pearl necklace she'd been fidgeting with earlier was now twisted around her fingers so tightly I thought it might break. Her face was bright red, and there were veins standing out on her forehead that I'd never noticed before. She looked like a stranger, nothing like the composed woman who'd greeted me at the door an hour ago. 30 years, she continued, her voice cracking with emotion. 30 years I've been part of this family, and you've never once treated me like I belonged here. Never once made me feel welcome in my own home. That caught me off guard. Mom had always seemed so confident, so in control of everything. I'd never realized she felt like an outsider. But now that she was saying it, I could see it. The way she always tried just a little too hard at family gatherings. The way she deferred to Grandma on everything from holiday menus to decorating choices. "I cooked your meals when you were sick," Mom went on, advancing on Grandma like she was going to physically attack her. "I drove you to doctor appointments. I listened to you complain about your arthritis. I rearranged my entire life around taking care of you after Harold died. And this is how you repay me?" The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Everyone was frozen, watching this meltdown like it was a car accident they couldn't look away from. Dad wasn't moving to defend his wife, which struck me as odd. Ethan had sunk back into his chair and was staring at the floor like he wanted to disappear into it. "You always looked down on me," Mom continued, her voice getting more hysterical with each word. "Because I didn't go to college, because I came from the wrong side of town. Because I wasn't good enough for your precious son. Well, guess what? I've been planning for this day too. I've been preparing for when you finally died and left us everything." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I felt sick to my stomach, partly from embarrassment, and partly from the realization that Mom had been thinking about Grandma's death as some kind of payday. It was ugly and mercenary and nothing like the woman who'd raised me. "But you gave it all to her," Mom spat, pointing at me like I was something disgusting she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. The disappointment, the one who couldn't even keep her marriage together, who's been living paycheck to paycheck for years. You gave $125 million to someone who doesn't even know how to balance a checkbook. That stung more than I wanted to admit. It was true that money had always been tight for me, especially after the divorce. But hearing my own mother describe me as a financial failure in front of the entire family was like being slapped across the face. "Do you have any idea what this does to me?" Mom continued, and now she was crying angry tears that left mascara streaks down her cheeks. "Do you understand that I've been counting on this money? That I've made plans based on what I thought we'd inherit?" There it was, the real reason for her meltdown. This wasn't about fairness or family loyalty. This was about Mom realizing that all her careful planning and years of playing the devoted daughter-in-law had been for nothing. She'd been banking on Grandma's money literally, and now it was gone. The worst part was watching Dad's reaction to all this. He just stood there, not defending Mom or trying to calm her down. He looked embarrassed, like he was seeing his wife clearly for the first time and didn't much like what he saw. Grandma waited until Mom had completely exhausted herself screaming before she spoke again. When she did, her voice was deadly calm, the kind of quiet that comes before a thunderstorm. "You're right about one thing, Linda," she said, using Mom's full name in a way that somehow made it sound like a curse word. "I never trusted you, and I was right not to." The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Mom's mouth fell open, but no sound came out. She looked like a fish, gasping for air. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" Grandma continued, her blue eyes fixed on Mom with laser focus. "About your visit to my lawyer last March? About how you tried to convince him that I was losing my mental capacity and needed help managing my affairs?" Oh God. I felt the blood drain from my face as the implications hit me. Mom had tried to have Grandma declared incompetent. She'd actually gone behind the family's back and attempted to take control of Grandma's finances while she was still alive. "That's not... I never..." Mom stammered, but Grandma held up one thin hand to stop her. "Mr. Patterson called me immediately, of course. We've been friends for 40 years, and he knows I'm as sharp as I ever was. But you didn't know that, did you? You thought you were being clever, playing the concerned daughter-in-law who was just worried about poor old Grandma's deteriorating mind." The room was so quiet I could hear someone's watch ticking. Dad looked like he'd been hit by a truck. This was clearly news to him too, which meant Mom had been working on this scheme entirely on her own. "You told him I'd been acting confused," Grandma went on, her voice getting stronger with each revelation. "That I'd been repeating myself, forgetting important conversations. You painted quite a picture of a woman who couldn't be trusted to make her own decisions anymore. I thought about all the times in recent months when Mom had made comments about Grandma's age, little suggestions that maybe she shouldn't be living alone, maybe she needed more supervision. I'd assumed it was genuine concern, but now I could see it for what it really was. Groundwork for a larger plan. But here's what you didn't count on," Grandma said, and now there was something almost like amusement in her voice. "I've been keeping track of everything. Every conversation, every visit. Every time you asked me about my finances, or my will, or my plans for the future. I wrote it all down in a little notebook I keep in my bedroom." She reached into her other pocket and pulled out a small leather journal, the kind you might buy at a drugstore. 43 separate occasions in the past year when you tried to get information about my money. 27 times you suggested I might want to simplify my financial situation. 15 times you offered to help me organize my important papers. Mom was backing away now, shaking her head like she could make this whole conversation disappear. But Grandma wasn't finished. "And then there was the day you went through my desk while I was napping. You thought I was asleep, but I heard you in there, going through my files looking for bank statements and insurance policies. That was when I knew for certain what kind of person you really are." The shame hit me like a physical blow, not for myself, but for Mom. To be exposed like this in front of the entire family was devastating. But at the same time, I felt a strange sense of relief. All these years I'd wondered why Grandma sometimes seemed distant with Mom, why there was always this subtle tension between them. Now I understood. "So you see, Linda," Grandma concluded, settling back into her chair with the satisfied air of someone who'd just won a chess game they'd been playing for months. "This money was never going to you anyway. Even if I'd left it to your husband or your son, I would have made sure you never got your hands on it. But giving it to someone who actually deserves it? That feels like justice to me." Dad finally found his voice. "Mother, is this true? Did Linda really try to—" "Every word," Grandma said simply. "Ask Mr. Patterson if you don't believe me. I'm sure he'd be happy to share the details of her visit." Mom collapsed into the nearest chair and buried her face in her hands. All the fight had gone out of her, replaced by the terrible realization that she'd been caught and exposed and lost everything she'd been scheming for. The family reunion ended with the kind of awkward exodus you see after a funeral. Everyone desperate to get out but trying not to look like they were running. Aunt Margaret was the first to leave, mumbling something about traffic on I-94. Uncle Robert and his family weren't far behind, suddenly remembering they had dinner plans they couldn't miss. I stayed put, partly because I was still processing everything that had happened, and partly because my legs felt too shaky to support me. The check was still in my hands, and I kept looking at it to make sure the numbers hadn't changed. $125 million. It was surreal. Dad hadn't said a word since Grandma's revelation about Mom's scheming. He just stood by the fireplace staring at nothing, looking older than I'd ever seen him. The confident man who'd announced Ethan's inheritance an hour ago was gone, replaced by someone who seemed genuinely lost. Ethan approached me as I was finally getting ready to leave. He looked embarrassed and young, more like the little brother I remembered from childhood than the successful businessman he'd been pretending to be. "Look, I had no idea," he said quietly, "about any of this. Dad just told me last week that I was getting the inheritance, and I guess I didn't question it because it's what I'd always expected." That was probably the most honest thing Ethan had said to me in years. We'd grown apart as adults, but underneath all the golden child stuff, he was still the kid who used to sneak into my room during thunderstorms because he was scared. "I know," I told him, "and I meant it. This isn't your fault." He nodded, looking relieved. Maybe we could have dinner sometime, just us. It's been too long since we actually talked." For the first time that day, I smiled. I'd like that. After he left, it was just me, Dad, Mom, and Grandma in the living room that had seen so much drama over the years. Mom was still sitting in her chair, staring at her hands like she was trying to figure out how everything had gone so wrong. Dad was pacing now, running his hands through his hair the way he used to when I was a teenager and had done something to disappoint him. I found myself alone with Grandma, while my parents had what sounded like a very quiet, very intense conversation in the kitchen. She was back in her corner chair, looking tired but somehow satisfied, like she'd finally gotten something important off her chest. "Grandma," I said, sitting down in the chair closest to hers, "why didn't you ever tell me about Mom, about what she was trying to do?" She was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear the grandfather clock ticking away in the hallway, marking time the same way it had through all the family dramas over the decades. "Because it wasn't your burden to carry, sweetheart," she said finally. "You had enough to worry about with your own life. And besides, I knew it would all come out eventually. It always does." I thought about that, about how many family secrets probably lived in this house, how many things had been left unsaid over the years. It made me sad, but it also made me grateful that at least this one had finally been exposed. "What should I do with all this money?" I asked, because honestly I had no idea. I'd never had to think about managing that kind of wealth before. Grandma smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like she had in those old photographs from when she was young. "Whatever makes you happy," she said. "Your grandfather and I lived through the Depression, so we never could bring ourselves to spend much. But you're different. You should live a little." When I finally left that house, driving down Maple Street toward my own small house across town, I felt like I was a completely different person than the one who'd arrived that afternoon. The woman who'd walked into that reunion had been worried about paying her credit card bills and wondering if she'd ever be able to retire. The one driving home was thinking about possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. But more than the money, more than the security it would bring, I was carrying something else with me. For the first time in my life, I knew without a doubt that someone had seen me clearly and decided I was worthy. That knowledge felt more valuable than any check, no matter how many zeros it had.